Teaching a beginning birding group how to use a spotting scope. Hi, this is another JDW Talks. If you want to know more about me, there's an address there. This was recorded in July of 2020. I dedicate it to those who lead field trips and introduce birding and the world of nature to the public. Well, here we are under a pandemic. Nature centers are closed, organized field trips are canceled, loaner binoculars and scopes are no longer available to the public. But people can still go in the field and observe nature, but be aware of social distancing and wearing masks. Stay away from areas with large numbers of people, and do not share your binoculars or field guides with others. Once things become normal, whatever that means, the use of shared items like spotting scopes may have to be reevaluated to guard against spread of disease. This video is for the time when we can get back to organized field trips. So first, let's try and define a spotting scope or a telescope. Most birders call it a scope. It's for terrestrial viewing. The image appears the same way our eye sees the scene. Astronomy telescopes, the view is a little bit different than that. There are many uses, but for our purposes, we're going to be using it for birding and nature observation. It's generally used in habitats where line of sight is unimpeded, such as coastal areas, large lakes, that sort of thing. And I personally used a number of different scopes for leading field trips for the public, biology students, marine biology, ornithology students, and up in Newport Bay, naturalist trainees and the docents there as well. First, what this video is not about. It's not a review of tripod and spotting scope brands. It is not a price guide to specific equipment. There's no emphasis on equipment specifications unless it is important to understand scope usage. And finally, telling field trip leaders and their advanced birding participants what I think they should know is not what this is about. I'm sure I can learn from them quite a bit. So let me at least say some advice, personal advice for individual buyers. Your first optical priority as a field biologist or field naturalist should be to get a good pair of binoculars. Once you are satisfied with that, you could get a spotting scope or even a super zoom camera if it fits your observation situation. For personal use, a straight-through scope is often preferred as being easier to use for following and sighting birds. And don't forget that you need a good tripod when you get a good scope. And here's some advice, personal advice, for trip leaders and people who are trying to buy equipment for nature preserves. If you're looking for a scope, do the research. Look at reviews and what others have bought. Figure out your budget. Figure out what you want in your equipment. And remember, especially true in optics, you get what you pay for. In your budget, put aside 10 to 15% of the purchase price of your scope for a good tripod. For leading group field trips, get an angled scope. And you might consider instead a super zoom camera with a field monitor. I'll talk about that at the very end. What this video is about. I'm hoping to give you some help with training docents in scope use and etiquette, instructing participants on public field trips on using this expensive optical mechanical device, getting the most of the equipment, and then safety factors for the participants and for the health of the spotting scope and tripod. My own scope history. At the age of 13, after saving up, proudly got a Balscope Senior. That was the spotting scope of the time, and I still have that. It's been broken once, and it was recreated basically with it in a machine shop. Then I found at a garage sale a mirroscope, an astronomy type scope, upgraded it and used that for a number of years. And then I moved up to the Swarovski 80mm angled scope. And now, besides all of those, I have a scope-like camera, the Nikon P1000 with a field monitor. So let's look at some spotting scope etiquette. And these are my own thoughts, and there's actually, if you do a Google search on that, you find a number of online websites, and I've gleaned some of their ideas as well. Rule number 1, don't kick the tripod leg. Don't put your nose or fingers on the eyepiece lenses. If you have a baseball style cap and you're looking through an angled scope, that brim is going to hit the scope and it's going to take it off target. So be aware of that. Push it back on your head. Do let the leader know if the bird has moved out of the view of the scope. Don't be embarrassed, because the next person won't see it either. Let people who haven't seen the species go first for scope looks. Now, for a beginning group, that's probably not as important, but when you have a group of birders, some who may have traveled, hundreds or thousands of miles and don't have the bird on their life list, it's just common courtesy to let them go first. Don't spend an excessive amount of time on looking at the scope of the bird, or try to take pictures while other people are waiting to see the bird. And in fact, in one of the online sites, it indicated that people should spend no more than 5 seconds on a scope view, and also pointed out that if after everyone has seen it and the bird's still there, then people could go back for a longer look, or perhaps take a photograph, providing that the leaders have given permission to do photographing through the scope. I'll talk about digiscoping in more detail in this talk. Don't walk in front of the scope while people are looking through it. That's pretty obvious. Don't touch the scope unless the leader has given you permission. It may not be the same for the next person. If you're in a non-group setting, always ask before looking through a person's scope. That's just common courtesy. And then share the job of carrying the scope and tripod if the group is asked to do so. Lots of possible etiquette situations here. Make sure that the tripod scope height is set for the shortest person on the trip, so that they won't have to struggle on tiptoes to see the bird. Keep track of children and warn them about tripping over the tripod legs. The scope is actually kind of a hazard, and if people are not knowing it's there, they can break a leg on that. And then don't invite members of the public nearby who look interested but are not part of your group for a scope view. Let the leader decide to invite them if he wishes. Okay, so that was a lot of different etiquette statements that I found online or on my own experience. So let's actually look at using spotting scopes and tripods. The tripod is really important. It's often overlooked in terms of buying and use. In many different models, prices are up and down the board. They're either metal or carbon fiber. The new ones are carbon fiber, a lot of them. Weight and cost factors in any buying situation. Carbon fiber tends to be much lighter. There are devices that are put underneath the tripod to prevent or to absorb vibration. But I've never seen a birder use these, I don't think. Of course, I have a set because I overbuy. They're mostly used for astronomy use and fixed site viewing. I mean, it would be ridiculous to keep carrying these around, and every time you put up a scope, you would have to put up these circles. And it's said that the more expensive tripods are said to have less vibration problems, especially crucial at high magnifications. Some tripods come with spikes on the bottom, either interchangeable with that rubber guard or the rubber cap. Some you rotate the rubber cap to expose the spike. Well, I can see that having an accident waiting to happen in a public field trip where you're carrying the scope, the spikes are in front, and you are distracted and you run into the person in front of you, spikes out. So I don't think that's a good idea. Let's go with rubber friction caps for legs. Some tripod makers include instructions when you buy the tripod. I have instructions from one which said that when you open the tripod, open up the sections, the legs, you do it from the top down. And then when you close the sections, you do it from the bottom up. You unlock the locking areas and you keep sliding the sections up. And presumably it's less stress on the locking joints if you do it that way. So kind of a simple sequence of photographs. I did a number of photographs in my side yard just to illustrate this talk. So here on the left is a 2-lock tripod. So there are, 3 sections. And you unlock the section closest to the top, slide that out, lock it in, and then unlock the next section, slide it out. And that's the sequence 1, 2, 3. And you reverse the process when you want to have the scope more compact. These locks on tripods are crucial. That's the danger point for the scope. I've seen many scopes lost by failure of a legs locking mechanism, including my own. And it usually happens when you're not near the scope, you can't get to it fast enough, and you watch with just horror as one of the legs gives off, the scope falls on its side, and it's usually on cement. Murphy's Law. So you should periodically check the locks in the field. When you set up the scope, put a little bit of downward pressure on it to see if those locks are still there. Just be careful, because this does happen. Don't over-tighten those locking mechanisms, as it could harm the locking mechanism itself. And know the weight limit for your tripod and don't exceed it. Just some common sense ideas. Now, in terms of carrying tripods, a lot of people just carry it on their shoulder with a unit horizontal, balanced. That's the usual method. The scope is usually behind you. It should be face down. Gravity will tend to move it that way anyway, and it avoids stress on the tripod mount. And you can make it yourself, or you could buy these. There are foam tubes that can be put on the tripod legs for comfort when you carry them. A lot of the tripods I've seen today have at least one of the legs with some foam around the top tube. However, I learned when reading gull bands that carrying scopes horizontally spooked the flock. I would start to read a band, I'd have to circle the gull and circle the flock, keeping track of that band. And if I put my scope horizontally, I think the gulls thought it might be some sort of weapon. So carrying the unit vertically and close to the body, even though it was kind of awkward, didn't spook the flock, and it reduced possibility of the scope becoming loose from its tripod mount. It's important that you establish a good behavior in terms of placing the scope on the ground. So here we have two possible positions, a leg away from you or a leg toward you. On the left, that's what you want to do. The reason is you don't want someone to kick the tripod. And if you did it on the right, that's just a opening. I mean, that's what's going to happen. Somebody's going to kick the tripod and knock you off the bird. So it's good habit to keep doing that, to put the first leg forward and then bring back the tripod and expand the two back legs on the ground. In terms of the mounting of the scope to the tripod, lots of different mounts. I prefer a one-handle mount that locks both vertical and horizontal movements at once, and it's certainly easier for beginners to understand that that's what you do if you desire to have them move the scope. Especially if you're training docents, you want them to go through as much experience on a scope as you can. I usually use a quick release plate because then I can tighten it really well on the tripod and not have to worry about damaging the screw of the scope itself. And all these things should be checked regularly in the field. The locking mechanisms of the legs and the scope attachment, and anyone who is responsible for that scope should be shown how to tighten both the scope mount and the locking leg mechanisms. I remember one time when I gave a scope to a student, and at the end of the field trip, that scope was basically free moving on the top of the tripod. Now, if we take a look at spotting scopes, there's a number of types. On the upper right, that's what I've gone through. My old bow scope on the bottom with a nose piece, that's how you changed eyepieces. A C90 mirror scope, and then the Swarovski 80mm on the top. Mirror scopes are used mainly for astronomy. They're really good for money value for magnification, but the spotting scopes are meant to sustain all the bumps and bruises of a field scope. Mirror scopes tend to look much more delicate. You handle them much more carefully, and my experience is that most beginners will gravitate toward a binocular looking like scope, i.e. a refractor scope. And when I brought a whole bunch of different scopes to one of my training sessions, most people didn't use mirror scopes, even though they have sighting devices on them, although usually the sighting device is upside down, unless it's a red dot sighting. So it's a nice little scope, but it's just not gotten popular. In terms of angled versus straight, the old Bosch & Lomb scope is a straight scope. The Swarovski is angled. And if you're in the field and have people of different heights, you can put the height of the tripod in such a way with an angled scope that everyone can look down at it. Even the tall person could look down. But when you're dealing with a straight scope on a tripod, you can imagine if you have it for a 6-foot person and someone who's 5'2" is there, they're not going to even tiptoes be able to look through that scope. Children are a special case if you want them to look through a scope, because they're going to be relatively short. There are some scopes that can compensate for this by rotating the scope. So the optical axis remains the same, and when you rotate it, you're still on the bird. And you can see now that a child can be looking up through the eyepiece when you adjust the scope in this manner. Now, finding the target, especially in angled scopes, may be difficult because you're not looking straight ahead. You're looking basically 45 degrees down. And this has been an old technique, although I just found a nice website on it that you can use a Ziploc tie as a sighting device. And some of these Ziplocs are releasable. So the one I'm going to show you has been on my scope for a long time. It's not releasable, but I can cut it off and use a releasable one. So this is the idea. The idea is that on the front you have one of these ties, and I've added a kind of a sighting target. I glue that on, and the idea is you're going to look through your eyepiece and then look straight up without moving your head, just your eye, until you align your object you're looking at the tip of the tie. So the first thing you would do if you went in the field was you would choose a distant object and you would move. You would slide the tie around the front of your tripod until you do match on that distant object. And now you have a way of sighting, a very cheap way to do it. Very effective though. Now, just like a microscope, when you teach people how to use a microscope, you say, don't scan in high power, do low power. And the reason is the lower the power, the greater the field of view. And the same thing is true of a spotting scope. So if you're trying to find some bird at 60 power, I don't think that's a good idea. You start with 20 power if you saw the bird way in the distance, and then you start to increase the magnification. So again, the higher the power, the quicker the view before that bird, which is moving in most cases, goes out of sight. And there's a temptation when you see a bird in a distance, or 100 feet out, 200 feet out, to up the magnification. But when you do that, you lower the field of view, and when you're trying to get other people to look at the bird through your scope, the chances are it's going to move out of the field of view much faster. It probably would be better to show the bird under a lower magnification, not as much detail, and satisfy more people in your group. And you're going to have to decide, in general anyway, whether you're going to allow your field trip participants to even touch the scope, to touch the focus or movement of the scope, especially with this pandemic. But obviously, if you're training docents, you want them to know how to get experience on how to focus or move the scope. So it's going to be interesting to see what's going to happen in the future. Now we're going to spend some time on this because it'll give you an indication of what's happening in the following situation. You have a person who's never used the scope before, comes up, you say there's a neat bird in the scope, take a look, and the person looks and looks and he comes and says to you, I don't see anything. I don't see an image at all. And it has everything to do with the human pupil and the scope's pupil. And I'm going to show you this in detail. So the scope has a pupil, as do your eyes. Your eyes have a pupil. And the trick is going to be to find the scope's pupil in space and then put your eye, your pupil, at the same spot as the scope's pupil where you get a complete view of the image. If you're off on that, you won't see anything. Your pupil size in bright light goes to be about 2 to 4 millimeters, and in the dark it expands to 4 to 8. Although age does play a role in how much your pupil size can vary. So what is the pupil size of a spotting scope? Well, you can measure that. It's also called the exit pupil, and the exit pupil is where the light rays exiting from the scope form a magnified circular image. So I can demonstrate that by taking a thin piece of paper with circles drawn on it as close to 2, 3, 4, etc. millimeters in diameter. Because the pupil size of an optical device like binoculars or a scope is set by a mathematical formula. The size of the exit pupil of scopes equals the size of the front lens in millimeters divided by the magnification. Let me show you that. Here is my spotting scope. I'm setting the zoom at 20 power. The front glass, the objective, is 80 millimeters. 80 by 20 divided by 20 is 4. The pupil size is 4. I take the scope out in my backyard. I point it to the sky so I can see that bright circle. I have my paper with the circles. Now, I position the paper in such a way that the circle of light is the sharpest, and I'll talk a bit about what that represents. And as you can see, I've lined up the circle, and it's 4 millimeters. So what happens when I change power to 60? So here on the zoom lens, I've gone to 60 power. 80 divided by 60 is 1.33. And let me show you that. Here's the pupil of the 20 power, and I've glued it onto the photograph of the 60 power. Okay, so that's a 4 millimeter pupil size when I measure it. Watch what happens when I remove that. You'll see what the pupil size looks like for 60 power. And you can see clearly here how big that pupil size really is. It would fit easily within that 2 millimeter circle. That's your challenge, to find that pupil size. And the higher the magnification, the harder it's going to be to find it. The point where that circle is the sharpest is called it's called the eye relief. So where the scope exit pupil is sharpest in space away from the eyepiece is called eye relief. And there on the bottom, I start the paper against the lens. It looks fuzzy. I start moving it away from the lens. It gets a little sharper. I move it a little bit farther. It's really sharp. That's where the eye relief is of the scope. If I continue to move that piece of paper farther away, it starts to get fuzzy again. And you can see now the problem with people who wear eyeglasses, especially people who wear eyeglasses because of astigmatism, like I do. You need your glasses to have good views of the image, and your eyeglasses may prevent you from having your pupil of your eye against the scope's pupil. And I'll show you what that looks like. And in order to do that, I'm setting my scope up on my neighbor's roof. And we're going to look at that point at the top of the triangle of his shingles and illustrate this. So let's do a demonstration of how to find the image and what I've been talking about, why that's important. So what you do is you come up to the scope and you tell people, you see that light circle? What I want you to do is to move your eye and your head, and they're connected in most cases, towards the circle until it shows the full image. Okay, we get closer with the iPhone 5S, and I'm taking these pictures in, and now you kind of see maybe part of the roof. Get a little closer, you're starting to see maybe a shingle or so. And this may be the view, kind of a keyhole view, that if you're wearing glasses and you can't get closer to get to that pupil size, you may be in trouble. And basically what you want to do is get close enough so that you're in the exit pupil at that eye relief so you can see the whole situation. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that in a second. So as I indicated, it's not unusual with spotting scopes with large eye relief but small exit pupils for beginners not to pick up any image when trying to look through the scope. They have missed the sweet spot. How big should the eye relief be? It should be at least 15 millimeters for eyeglass users, and the scope I have it's 17. If it was less than 15, then your people who have glasses on may not be able to see the full extent of the image. And you can realize that in a situation with children, this happens all the time. The parent wants the kid to see what they see. So they lift up this struggling small child to look through a spotting scope, which doesn't rotate, on a high tripod. And invariably, the children are not looking straight down at the eyepiece, the ocular. They're looking at a corner, and they're so close they're closer than the eye relief, and they don't see anything. And the parent keeps saying blah blah blah, and finally the kid said, "Yeah, I see that blah blah blah," and they're just placating the adults. If they ask them what they see, you'll find out that they're not seeing anything at all. I want to introduce the subject of digiscoping in a little more formal way. It'll also give us some other insight into eyeglass users and the problems they have with scopes. Digiscoping is when you try and put a camera against the spotting scope to get a picture, and it can cause damage to the lens. Those zoom lenses cost on the Swarovskis about $600, and if there is a damage there, a scratch, it may make that lens useless. So one has to be careful on that. There is a way of avoiding that problem by putting a cap or some sort of cap on the eyepiece. This is made, this is one of my caps made from the front cap of a large binocular. A hole was put in the very, very center of it. I punched it out, and I think I found some sort of other round object so that it could fit on the eyepiece well. So now we have a hole at the exit pupil. The exit pupil is going to come through there, and the question is, we should probably put that surface at the level of the eye relief, right? It should be at the eye relief. Now, binoculars, spotting scopes, etc., have the ability to produce kind of hoods, sunshades, so that the sun doesn't hit the surface of the glass. And you can see here on the spotting scope, on the left, the eye cups are pretty much flat with the eyepiece surface, and on the right they are extended. So it only makes sense that when you're digiscoping with that sort of cap that you would extend out the eye cups. And it also makes sense that normally those eye cups should be flat against the eyepieces for the people in your group that wear eyeglasses. So that's an important aspect of things. And I'll show you the difference that's going to make also in terms of the camera and the settings you want to put on the camera. So let's do some digiscoping of that roof next to me. And I put my iPhone on that circle. I go right down. I don't touch the glass surface at all. The iPhone is at 1 power magnification, and you get a picture like that. And it's called vignetting when you see that circle with black around it. Let's see what happens when you zoom in with the phone on that circle. And when you do that on the iPhone at 6x, the circle disappears, and still the quality is pretty darn good. And this is why a lot of people do digiscoping. Um, really nice results often, and it's a great technique. But you have to be careful in terms of scratching the lens, and that's why you just don't want the public just to come up and try and take pictures unless you have some sort of protection mechanism for your scope. Now, I indicated at the beginning that there might be an alternative to a spotting scope, and that is a super zoom camera with a field monitor. And I am putting with this video on YouTube, the one you're looking at, to give you an indication and some pros and cons of using such a piece of equipment. My next binocular optical video is going to be trying to make a video of a publication I did producing a workshop to let people understand how binoculars work, how to use them, etc. Yeah, if you're a teacher or wanting to set up a laboratory on binoculars, or just an interested person, I put a copy of this workshop on my Dropbox account, and you're welcome to get it for free and use it. So I hope that with this short, which it really is short, introduction to spotting scopes, especially for beginning birding groups and people who have not worked with these as much, people who train docents in the use of this expensive piece of equipment. I hope that some of my experiences have helped you. This has been another of my JDW talks. I have 2 virtual birding field trips here, one on coastal sage and one on coastal birding in Dana Point area, California. I have 2 talks on the life of the naturalist Adolphus Heumann, whose name adorns a number of species in honor of him, including a gull species, lots of botanical species, and even some fossils. I have talks on census research. That's what I'm most well known for right now, especially the 1950 census that would become public in April of 2022. And I'll have by the end of August 5 Ellis Island talks on how to find difficult people and the name change myth. Hope you got a lot out of this. You could always subscribe to my channel and spread the word if you enjoyed this presentation.